Right back live here. Let's turn to this now. Getting more reaction to the President's budget vote. Joined now by UDM Deputy President, also Parliamentary Leader now, Nqabayomzi Kwankwa. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. The President tells us that he's 30 million or so, or maybe a little bit more, that he's going to be using. He's going to use towards one, capacitating work that he's already done. And one of the programs that are run in the presidency is the Vulindlela program, which he says, if you look at the National Logistics Task Team, if you look at the Task Team for Energy, those are initiatives that are beginning to bear fruit. Is that a good way of allocating money?
Well, not entirely from where we're sitting. Look, the strategy of the Office of the President has a strategic role to play in helping us to remodel the service delivery machinery in the country, in providing strategic direction and leadership for government in South Africa and continentally. It is a bit of a pity that this speech tended to focus mainly on some operational issues without dealing specifically with how the allocations when it comes to the line functions or operational plans of the president are going to help to support his office. The issue here is that the budget vote one, there's just limited documentation because there's no portfolio committee or an oversight mechanism over the presidency. It makes it difficult now for members of parliament to be able to engage and scrutinize the work of that very important office and see whether there's an alignment between its strategic objectives, the work it does, and the performance indicators or performance of the various government departments, because that's the only way you can be able to check whether the office is serving its mandate. But also our concern, naturally because of time constraints, we couldn't deal with that. This aspect, which is very important, that the more departments are actually taken to the presidency, the more you require to scrutinize and hold that office to account, because the work of the various departments, including the SOEs, which were mentioned in your insert, is very critical and can be shrouded in secrecy. And it's one of the issues that we must grapple with, deal with precisely so that there's accountability, because otherwise what's going to happen is that every time there's a department that is not performing optimally, then the president will just take that and put it under the presidency to run away from answering tough and difficult questions at the time, say, some of the entities might not be performing well. We don't want to do that because those entities utilize state resources. So that's why we made, it's a pity you did not include our input in that insert, that one of the things we said, yes, it must be a portfolio committee. However, it should be the Director General in the presidency. We could take it a step further and say, instead of getting the president to be the one who accounts regularly via that portfolio committee to Parliament, you could get the minister in the presidency to be the one who accompanies the Director General in the presidency. Or you could even extend it to say the deputy president can be given that responsibility as part and parcel of his additional political oversight over the work of the presidency. But indeed, Operation Vulindlela, it's been there as a strategy for a while, even when it comes to dealing with logistical issues in the country, trying to attract foreign direct investment or investment into the country. But our view as the UDM is that the initiatives should be coordinated in such a way that you are able, as you build capacity within the state, take advantage of growth opportunities outside of our country, continentally. But you can't do that if you don't deal with the binding constraints on the economy, the energy issue, which the president spoke about, port inefficiency in the country. Because if you want to grow the economy, it means we must actually be able to produce things that we can sell to the rest of the world, including the African continent. And if we can't deal with port inefficiency, firstly, as a way of improving the capacity of the South African economy to trade with the rest of the world, we will not be able, unfortunately, to even take advantage of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement.
So, I mean, one, as you put it, one of the areas is the area of improving service delivery. The president pointing out that a large part of this money in administration, for example, is going to be spent in another task team called the Presidential Working Group which they are piloting, I suppose, part of it in the eThekwini municipality there, which has been reactivated. It says the president initially said, no, I'm going to put the district development model. This is going to help me be able to check out what's happening at municipalities and have direct, almost real-time intervention. Seems that is not working. Now he's coming up with another thing called the Presidential Working Group. Do you think what could not have been achieved by the district development model can be now achieved by the Presidential Working Group?
Well, it also means, I think it's about time that we get the KPAs or performance indicators, or what do you call them, KPAs of the various ministers, the line ministers in particular, so that we can be able, they are made public, so that we can be able to know who's doing his or her job and who's not pulling his or her weight, so that those who are driftwood in the cabinet can be held to account. Because if we don't do it that way, it means every time some or other department fails to perform its duties, then that function will just be lumped to a presidency, which becomes too big, too unwieldy, and a presidency that then you can't even do a proper oversight. Before we know it, if we're not careful, we might end up having the entire functions of quite a number of line functions or line departments of government being actually slotted into the presidency simply because some or other people who occupy positions as line ministers did not do their jobs. I think it's about time we actually have the discussion publicly about how the performance appraisal and performance reviews of the different ministers and how that performance information and discussion can actually be made public so that people can be able to know who among the ministers are actually doing their jobs and who should actually be removed from their positions. That way, you would not have to actually establish one task team after another, because then you'll be able to identify where the challenges and the performance gaps are and be able to make the necessary interventions well on time to make sure that the objectives set by the government are indeed attained. If they are not attained, there must be full accountability about why some of the objectives have been missed. One of the points I made, for example, on behalf of the UDM, was the lack of alignment between the National Development Plan. I didn't make it today. We're responding to the opening of Parliament address, saying there has been no alignment between NDP goals as well as the annual performance plans of the various departments. Now, it is small wonder then why most of those targets have not been achieved, because Parliament itself was not able to keep those targets, if they are not aligned, in check, to check whether or not the ministers were achieving or doing what they were supposed to do. Now, even when the government talks about this medium-term development strategy or plan, if there's no alignment between what the departments are doing and that plan, those objectives as well are not going to be achieved. One of the issues that Parliament has to do religiously is to make sure that in the annual performance plans, if there's alignment and we pick up gaps, we must flag them, hold people to account, and use it as a performance management tool, instead of rather at times asking superficial questions about political matters that have nothing to do at times with the actual work of the department and in the process of trying to improve the material conditions of our people.
The president has got some programs that are within, again, in the presidency. I don't know if there's a way of really confirming what he says these programs have achieved. The Presidential Employment Stimulus is one such program. The other one is the Presidential Youth Employment Program. One says it's created 2 million jobs. The other one also saying it has significantly made a dent in terms of interventions. How does one weigh those particular programs? I think the one he says 1.3 million earning opportunities were created through the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative.
No, we use, I think there's a temptation to use very vague and broad language, which makes it difficult for one to be able to quantify the actual impact of the programs. For example, job opportunities instead of jobs. Earning opportunities instead of being able to quantify and be precise in terms of what that which we seek to achieve with the programs. Yes, it is great and commendable that the president has some initiatives which are housed in his office, which are trying to deal with specific issues in terms of the country and the challenges that we face. However, it is important that we need to know upfront when funding is allocated towards specific programs, if the targets are set well in advance to say, this is what we seek to achieve with this initiative, this is the amount of money that we're going to allocate towards it, so that we're able to keep track on it. But you can't keep track on it if the reporting happens informally, if there is no process in Parliament where we can scrutinize the reports that are actually tabled, or rather the information that the president actually cites every now and then as if it's successes of those programs. You need a process where there can be public scrutiny of those figures, public scrutiny of the targets, because how do we know whether the targets which were set initially have been achieved? How do we know? How would we be able to tell whether, in fact, the resources allocated for that specific program were utilized optimally? Now, we are citing figures in a vacuum without being able to do a proper analysis of the context and the inputs that went into the output that the president is talking about. I think that is the challenge in the main with the number of initiatives that is put in place. For an example, remember we had investment conferences in the past. The president would say so much money had been fundraised, so much money had been raised in terms of investment, which was going to come into the country, but no one has actually sat down to say commitments were made, but this money is invested in the economy. If they were indeed invested in the economy, what was the social impact? Was it able to create jobs? Was it able to make a dent in the unemployment rate? Was it able to increase the economic growth of the country? So we end up discussing nominal issues without actually dealing with issues in real terms.
One line item certainly that, even though not articulated in Budget 1, is where the money goes, is to the Office of the Deputy President. He says in his capacity as leader of government business, he was monitoring and will continue to monitor the executive accountability to Parliament. How well has he done there?
Well, at times I think there were times when he did well, but I think in the last year in particular, there were many instances where the Speaker of the National Assembly had to prevail on the Deputy President and some members of the executive to answer questions, to come to Parliament for question sessions, to account to committees, and not to abdicate responsibility to deputies. In the majority of instances, deputy ministers were not fully acquainted with the work of their departments for whatever reasons. As a result, in instances in the past where deputy ministers had to come to account to Parliament on behalf of a particular department, we usually got vague responses, and they would actually defer some of the matters to their political principals. Some of them did not always appear in Parliament. It comes to questions for written reply. It became a challenge at some point, but the situation got improved slightly towards the end of the term. And now that we also part of the GNU, we are going to make sure that we keep him in check. We're going to make sure that we have those discussions with them to make sure that members of the executive, when they appear before portfolio committees, they do, rather when they are supposed to be in Parliament, to account to the public and members of Parliament, that indeed will happen. But also it has to do with a better coordination of the work of Parliament, so that we work collaboratively with the executive when it comes to scheduling the work of Parliament, understanding what their roles and their schedules are versus what we have to do in terms of the constitutional mandate that we must discharge. So it's an important balancing act. It's also an important responsibility that the Deputy President has, one that he has actually done very well in the past on, but there were certain challenges which we would then have to actually sit around the table and say, how do we prevent further recurrence of some of the problems in the past? We had ministers in the past, for example, like Minister Pravin Gordhan, who just refused to appear before a specific committee, the Committee on Public Enterprises, and there were no sanctions imposed. That's why one of the proposals we made in the budget vote on Parliament yesterday, we said, in other jurisdictions such as Kenya, they have what they call a motion of censure, where a motion of censure would be moved in a minister who's failing either to avail themselves, say, for a question session or to answer questions in Parliament. and that motion of censure would be passed by a vote, we made a proposal to say it's one of the vehicles or mechanisms that we can use or adopt to hold truant ministers to account, and ministers who don't take the work of the executive and their work seriously insofar as being able to make time for parliamentary sessions is concerned.
Nqabayomzi Kwankwa, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on, Deputy President for UDM. Also, the party's parliamentary leader now, with the General now a Deputy Minister.